most of the participants here have written manifestos. I've no manifesto to propound, and I don't think I ever drafted a document under that name, although I've drafted similar things. However, I've been reading documents called manifestos for the best part of a century, and I suppose that gives me some credibility as a commentator today. I started my intellectual life at school in Berlin at the age of 15 with one manifesto, Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. I have a press photograph of me in my 80s reading the Italian journal Il Manifesto. Because my parents were married in Zurich during World War I, among Lenin and the Dadaists of the Cabaret Voltaire, I would like to think that a Dadaist manifesto issued a loud fart at the moment of my conception. But unfortunately, the first Dadaist manifesto was recited 3 months before this could have happened. Actually, systematic manifesto readers are a 20th century species. There had been plenty of collective statements, mainly religious and political in earlier centuries, but they went under different labels. There were, for instance, the great declarations, the Declaration of Independence of the USA, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, but probably these, while they're still around, they still survive mostly under very official auspices like the Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. How will manifestos survive the 21st centuries? Political parties and movements aren't what they were in the last century, and they were, after all, one of the two great producers of manifestos. The arts were the other. Again, with the rise of business society and the MBA jargon, they have been largely replaced by that appalling invention, the mission statement. None of the mission statements I've come across says anything worth saying unless you're a fan of badly written platitudes. You can't walk more than a few yards through the undergrowth of print without stubbing your toe on some example, almost universally empty in sentiment, telling you the equivalent of "have a nice day" and "your call is important to us." Still, manifestos are competing quite successfully with mission statements. There are almost 20 million potential clicks under this heading on Google, and even allowing for the fact that many of them refer to manifesto records, this still leaves plenty. I can't say they all live up to the dictionary definition, which is, as you know, a public declaration of principles, policies, or intentions, especially of a political nature, or I might add, of any nature, because among the ones that I've looked at, they include a breastfeeding manifesto, a wildlife gardening manifesto, a manifesto for the hills, which deals with livestock in the Scots Highlands, and a rather tempting manifesto for a new walking culture by Rights and Sights, with plenty of reference to Dadaist situationists André Breton and Brecht, but rather surprisingly, none to that typical champion of the urban walkers or flaneurs, Walter Benjamin. And of course, they include all the manifestos in this matter. I haven't had a chance to hear many of these, but one thing that strikes me about the list is that so many of the ones this weekend are individual statements, and not like almost all manifestos in the past, group statements representing some collective we, formally organized or not. Certainly, that was the case of all political manifestos I can think of. They always speak in the plural and aim to win supporters also in the plural. That is also the case traditionally in the arts. Ever since the futurists introduced the word into the world of art in 1909, thanks to Marinetti's Italian gift of the rhetorical gag. In doing so, I think they probably beat the French to it by a few years. I'm certain that the Cubists would have liked to invent the M word, but they were not very political at that time and better at thinking in paint than in words. Now, when I talk of art manifestos, I'm thinking primarily of avant-gardes which recognize themselves at the time, not of labels and schools which are created retrospectively, like post-impressionism, or the ones invented by critics and increasingly by dealers like abstract expressionism. I'm thinking of real groups of people, sometimes built around a person or a periodical, however shortly, conscious of what they are against and of what they think they have in common. Dadaists, surrealists, the style, left, or, take a local example, the independent group round which pop art emerged in this country in the 1950s. Or, for that matter, the original photographers' collective Magnum. If you like, they are all campaigning bodies. I'm not sure what purely individual manifestos are there for, other than one person's fears for the present and hopes for the future, which they may or may not hope is shared by others. How is this to be realized? Is it primarily by self-cultivation and shared experience, as Vivienne Westwood tells us in her rather attractive manifesto? How else? The futurists invented public self-advertisement. It's a sign of our disintegrating and chaotic society that media publicity is today the first thing that comes into a potential manifestant's mind rather than the traditional way of collective action. Of course, individuals may also use manifestos to advertise their brand. The word, you may remember, has already been mentioned here, some kind of innovation or some kind of characteristic. And then there are also, I'm sorry to say, the terrorist manifestos along the lines pioneered by the Unabomber in 1995, which advertise an individual attempt to change society. In the Unabomber's case, by sending incendiary bombs to selected enemies. I'm not sure whether this belongs into the fields of conceptual art or politics or both. It has since had some scary success in the suicide videos of terrorists. And one shouldn't actually joke about it, but these must also be regarded in their own way as individual manifestos as well as hoping to be collective. And yet there is also another purely individualist manifesto or ego trip that has nobody in mind at all except the solipsist who issues it. The extreme example of this, you may remember, is that extraordinary document, Yves Klein's Chelsea Hotel Manifesto of 1961. Klein, as some of you may know, had built a career on painting a single color, an immediately recognizable dark blue, nothing else. He painted it on square and oblong canvases, on anything three-dimensional, mostly sponges, but also on models whom he got to roll in that paint. The manifesto explains that this was because he was haunted by the blue sky, although I must say Klein's blue is as uncerulean a colour as I've ever seen. As he lay on the beach in Nice, he tells us in his manifesto, I quote, I began to feel hatred for the birds which flew back and forth across my blue cloudless sky because they tried to bore holes in my greatest and most beautiful work. Birds must be eliminated. I don't have to tell you that Klein found critics to explain his profundity and dealers to sell him to the punters. He has been given the sort of immortality he deserved by the Gagosian Gallery, which has copyrighted his manifesto. This brings me to the contents of the manifestos of my lifetime. The first thing that strikes me, looking back on them, is that the real interest in these documents is not in what they actually call for. Most of that tends to be either obvious, even platitudinous, and large landfill sites could be made to overflow with such stuff. Or else it is destined for rapid obsolescence. This is true even of the great and inspiring Communist Manifesto, which remains so alive that in the last 10 years it has been rediscovered, unfortunately not by the left, which no longer exists as a significant force, but by the businessmen whose world it predicted so successfully. The reason we read it today is the same that made me read it when I was 15. It's a wonderful, irresistible style and verve of the text, but chiefly it is a soaring, analytical vision of world change in the first few pages. Most of what the Communist Manifesto actually recommended is of purely historical interest, and most readers skip it, except for the clarion call at the end. Remember, the workers have nothing to lose except their chains. They have a world to win. Workers of all countries unite. Unfortunately, even this is also well past its sell-by date. Of course, that is a trouble about the future, about any writings about the future. The future is unknowable. We know what we don't like about the present and why, which is why all the manifestos are best at denunciation, even if they're no good at analysis. The ones that are good at analysis are the ones worth reading, and just as the ones that are good in style are the ones worth reading. As for the future, the only thing we know about it, that is absolutely certain about it, is that what we do with or without manifestos behind us will have unintended consequences. But we can still do it, and we can still hope, and we must. If all this is true of so permanent a text as the Communist Manifesto, it's even more true of manifestos in the creative arts. For a lot of artists, as an American jazz player once told me in a nightclub, words are not my instrument. Even when they are, as among poets, even among the very bright ones, creation doesn't follow the path I think and therefore I write. But it follows a much less controllable, much more intuitive path in which intellect enters in a different way. That, if I may say so, is a trouble with conceptual art. It starts with ideas. But intellectually, the ideas in conceptual art are usually uninteresting, unless they can be read as jokes, like Duchamp's urinal, or, in my mind, much more fun, Paul Klee. As for the results, we still argue about them, and I don't wish to join the argument. So, reading manifestos in the arts for their intended meaning is a frustrated experience, except maybe as a performance. And even then, they are better as wit and jokes than in the oratorical mode. This is probably why Dada, that style for stand-up comics, is still the standby of so many manifestos today. Its humor is both funny and black, and like surrealism, it doesn't call for interpretations, but for the imagination to play. And that is, after all, the foundation of creative work, the play of the imagination. And anyway, the test of the pudding is not the description of the dish on the restaurant menu, however flowery, but what is produced, the eating of it. But this is where the creators in the arts have been much more successful than their manifestos. In my history of the 20th century, the age of extremes, I wrote, excuse me for quoting myself, why brilliant fashion designers, a notoriously non-analytic breed, sometimes succeed in anticipating the shape of things to come better than professional predictors, is one of the most obscure questions in history, and for the historian of the arts, one of the most central. I still don't know the answer. Looking back at the arts in the last decade before 1914, we can see how much they anticipated the breakdown of bourgeois civilization after 1914. Who knows whether a historian writing 50 years hence may say the same about what is happening in the arts, or what is today given the name of the arts, in our moment of capitalist crisis and retreat for the rich civilizations of the West. Like in the film Man on Wire, but much more uneasily, the arts walk the tightrope between soul and market, between individual and collective creation, even between recognizable and identifiable human creative products and their engulfment by technology, algorithms, and the all-embracing noise of the internet. Where do we go? On the whole, late capitalism has provided a good living for more creative people than ever before. But fortunately, it hasn't made them satisfied either with their situation or with society. They fear and they hope. What anticipations will the historian of 2060 read into the cultural production for the past 30 years? I don't know, and I can't know. But there'll be a few manifestos on the way. Thank you.